Chapter 16. Peace and Confrontation. Several references have been made to two groups of Muslims in Medina, those who came from Mecca, or the Muhajirin, and the ethnic people of the Ansar. It should be emphasized, however, that the distinction was of no lasting consequence. Both groups formed a single cohesive unit based on equality and brotherhood. It is perhaps impossible to exaggerate the strength of ties between the members of that first Islamic community. Internally, the structure of the Muslim nation was very sound. The Prophet then had to attend to the nation's external relations. There were two levels of these relations. Firstly, with the Quraysh, who felt very hostile to the new state. It was inevitable that the Quraysh would pose a serious threat, though perhaps not immediately. The rest of Arabia adopted an attitude of wait and see, preferring not to commit themselves to Islam until the conflict with the Quraysh had been resolved. Secondly, there were the other communities in Medina itself. Islam had been accused over the years of being intolerant to other religions. Nothing can be further from the truth. The example of Medina gives an insight into the true nature of this religion. There were two additional main communities in Medina besides the Muslim nation. The Jews had their own independent community. They could easily separate themselves from the rest of the population of Medina. There were also the Arabs who had not yet accepted Islam. These belonged to the same tribes as the Ansar. No open hostility between them and the Ansar was noticed. On the contrary, amicable relations were expected to continue between the two sides. Indeed, it was expected that more and more of those Arabs would come to realize the truth of Islam and adopt it. The Prophet, however, proceeded to put relations with the two communities on a clear and firm footing. He also regularized relations and commitments within the Muslim community. A covenant was drawn up defining the responsibilities of every group within the Muslim community and outlining the nature of its relations with the Jews. Here is a translation of this constitutional document, which defined obligations, responsibilities, and loyalties within the new state and towards other groups and communities. In the name of God, the Merciful, the Beneficent. This is a document drawn up by Muhammad, peace be upon him, the Prophet, for the believers and the Muslims from the Quraysh and Yathrib, and whoever joins them and takes part in their struggle for their cause. They are one nation, distinguished from all other people. The Muhajirin of the Quraysh remain the same, bearing the responsibility for the blood money they incur. They pay for the release of those taken prisoner from among them, according to what is reasonable and fair among believers. The Auf clan remain the same, bearing responsibility for the blood money they incur. Every group pays for the release of its prisoners in accordance with what is reasonable and fair among believers. The document repeats these terms with each of the Ansar clans: Saida, Al-Harith, Jusham, Al-Najjar, Amr ibn Auf, Al-Nabit, and Al-Aus. It then goes on, the believers shall not leave any one of them bearing heavy debts without reasonably helping him in the payment of blood money or ransom. No believer shall contract an alliance with the slave of another believer in preference to himself. The God-fearing believers stand against anyone among their number who transgresses or is guilty of oppression or indulges in an act of sin or aggression or corruption among the believers. They shall stand together against him, even though he may be the son of any one of them. No believer shall kill another believer in retaliation for the killing of a non-believer, nor shall he support a non-believer against a believer. Pledges of protection given under an oath apply to all. The least distinguished among the believers may offer a pledge of protection which is binding on all of them. Believers are one another's allies against all people. Anyone from among the Jews who joins us shall have our support and equal rights with us, suffering no oppression and fearing no alliance against them. Believers shall have a single pledge of peace. No believer shall make a peace agreement to the exclusion of another believer concerning any fighting for God's cause, unless this agreement applies to all of them equally and fairly. Every group which joins us in an expedition of jihad shall carry its own numbers. The believers are equal with regard to sacrificing their lives for God's cause. The God-fearing believers are committed to the best and straightest guidance. No non-believer shall extend protection to any property or any person belonging to the Quraysh, nor shall he stand between them and any believer. Anyone who kills a believer and is proven guilty shall be taken in retaliation, unless the victim's next of kin forgoes his right. All the believers shall unite against the killer, and it shall not be lawful for them to do anything other than bring him to justice. No believer who accepts this treaty and believes in God and the last day may give support or shelter to any criminal. Anyone who gives such support or shelter to a criminal incurs God's curse and his anger on the day of judgment. No compensation shall be accepted from him. On whatever you may differ, the final verdict rests with God and with Muhammad, peace be upon him. The Jews shall share expenses with the believers as long as they are at war with others. The Jewish allies of the Auf clan shall support the believers. The Jews have their own religion and the Muslims have their own. This applies to them and their allies. Anyone who is guilty of oppression or commits a sin only brings himself and his household to ruin. The Jewish allies of the clans of Al-Najjar, Al-Harith, Saida, Jusham, Al-Aus, and Talaba enjoy the same rights as the Jewish allies of Auf. Anyone who commits injustice or a sin only brings himself and his household to ruin. Jaffna is a branch of Talaba who enjoy the same rights. The Shutayba clan have the same rights as the Jewish allies of Auf. Honoring and fulfilling these conditions should be a barrier which prevents their violation. Whatever applies to the clan of Talaba also applies to their allies. The families and households of the Jews are in the same position as themselves. No one of them shall leave without the permission of Muhammad, peace be upon him. Nothing shall be allowed to prevent retaliation for an injury. Whoever kills actually kills himself and brings his whole household to ruin, with the exception of one who is victim of injustice. God certainly approves these terms. The Jews shall bear their expenses, and the Muslims shall bear theirs. They are required to render support against anyone who fights any party to this agreement. They owe it to each other to give sincere counsel. Fulfillment of the terms of this agreement should prevent its violation. No one shall be held responsible for a sinful action perpetrated by his ally. Support shall be given to the oppressed. The Jews are required to share the expenses with believers as long as the latter are engaged in a war. The center of the city of Medina is forbidden to the parties of this agreement. It shall be the same for oneself as a neighbor. He shall not be allowed to suffer any harm and commit a sin. No sanctity shall be protected without the consent of its people. Anything that takes place between the parties to this agreement or any dispute that may develop between them is to be referred for arbitration to God, the Almighty, and to Muhammad, peace be upon him, his messenger. God approves the best and most pious elements that this agreement contains. Nothing that belongs to the Quraysh or to those who support it shall be protected. The parties to this agreement shall support each other against anyone who attacks Yathrib. If they are called upon to enter into any peace agreement, then they will do so. If they are invited to something like that, then the believers are required to support it, except with those who fight to suppress the faith. Every group shall bear its share of responsibility in the part closest to them. The Jewish allies of Al-Aus, their own people and their allies, have the same rights and obligations as the parties to this agreement, and this shall be sincerely honored by the parties to this agreement. Fulfillment of the terms and conditions of this agreement shall prevent their cancellation. Everyone shall bear the responsibility for whatever action he perpetrates. God approves the best and most truthful of what this agreement contains. This agreement does not give immunity from punishment to anyone guilty of oppression or sin. He who leaves Medina shall be safe, and he who stays shall be safe, unless he is guilty of injustice or sin. God is the protector of those who fulfilled their pledges and are God-fearing, and so is Muhammad, peace be upon him, God's messenger. This agreement was the first of its kind in Arabia. It defines the sort of relationship that should exist within the Muslim community, and it defines the position of the Jews and their relationship with the Muslim state. The agreement considers the Jews as citizens within the Muslim state. They enjoyed their religious freedom and state protection. They were required to support the Muslim state against an enemy that attacked it. The Jews were also required to give sincere counsel to the Muslim state and never to conspire against it or to withhold information which was important to the security of the Muslim state. On the other hand, they were not allowed to leave Medina without permission from the Muslim state, which enjoyed all sovereignty and would arbitrate in any dispute that might arise between the Jews and the Muslims. The arrival of the Prophet, peace be upon him, in Medina heralded the establishment of the first Islamic state in history. That the foundations of this state needed continuous consolidation was very clear to the Prophet, right from the beginning. His initial major actions as he took charge in Medina reflect his keen awareness of that need. He built the mosque, which was a place of worship, a people's assembly, and the palace of government, all in one. He established a new and strong bond of brotherhood between his followers to consolidate the inner structure of his community. He also signed a treaty with the Jews to ensure peace in Medina and to free himself to face outside threats, which were only to be expected. The Quraysh could not remain idle while the new state in Medina acquired increasing strength. The Quraysh was bound to conclude that the Islamic state in Medina was going to challenge for supremacy in Arabia. It was expected that the Quraysh might, before long, try to launch an all-out campaign to eliminate such a challenge before it had a chance to gather strength. A show of force by the Muslims in Medina was therefore important in order to make the Quraysh think twice before embarking on any such hazardous course of action. One may note here that up to the last few months of the Prophet's active work for Islam in Mecca, Muslims were commanded by God not to resort to arms in any confrontation with non-believers. Several reasons may be advanced for such a policy. Firstly, the Meccan period was one of education of a certain people in a new tradition. The Muslim Arabs had to be trained not to retaliate for personal injury, but to look beyond their own persons and interests and to think first of their new community. Secondly, the use of force in the Meccan period might have led to increased stubbornness on the part of the Quraysh and consequently to a never-ending series of killing for vengeance. The blame for such an event would undoubtedly have been laid at the door of Islam. Thirdly, the use of force might have led to numerous little family wars as the believers still lived with their own families and clans. Since the Muslims were still small in number, they might have been totally exterminated. Fourthly, Muslims would have lost all the support of their clans. We have seen how the support of the Hashemites guaranteed for the Prophet all the protection he needed to continue his efforts in fulfillment of his mission. As the Meccan period drew to an end, permission to fight the non-believers was given to the Prophet and his followers. This came in a Quranic verse which was revealed shortly before the Ansar made their second covenant with the Prophet. No fighting, however, took place before the Prophet's emigration. There was every indication that it would come soon. Hence, preparations for such an eventuality were called for. The Muhajirin and the Ansar were good fighters. Almost every one of them had fought with his tribe. As already related, the two tribes to whom the Ansar belonged were involved in a fierce battle shortly before they came to know about Islam. But all this experience was not quite enough for the Prophet's purposes. The Muslim community would never fight a tribal war. A new army had to be built on a basis totally different from anything known in Arabia, the basis of faith. Thus, the purpose of war would be different. The soldier's attitude to death in battle would be based on the Islamic view that a martyr is certain to be admitted to heaven. His attitude to his fellow soldiers would also be completely different. The Prophet wasted no time in building such an army. The Prophet had moved without a moment's delay to consolidate the foundations of his new state. Internally, the fabric of the social structure of the new society was of the highest quality. Relations with other communities in Medina were put on a sound basis. A well-trained army, which was soon to prove its caliber, was built up. The establishment of the new state was indeed a great achievement which crowned the Prophet's hard work over the past 14 years. Since Medina was not an isolated city, its relations with its neighbors were highly important. All around Medina, there were Bedouin tribes which did not have much of an idea about Islam. Independent though these tribes were, their natural sympathies were with the Quraysh. Like the Quraysh, there were pagans for whom religious values did not count for much. More importantly, the Quraysh was still the recognized superpower in Arabia. Something had to be done to persuade those Arab tribes that things had changed. Moreover, the Prophet's mission was universal. That is, he was commanded by God to make his message known to all mankind and to call upon them to believe in it. At no time did the Prophet envisage the establishment of the new state as his final objective. It was simply the base from which he would move to explain his message to the rest of Arabia, and thence to the world at large. To achieve both objectives, the Prophet started to send out armed groups of his companions in what historians have called saraya, which may be roughly translated as expeditions. Practically speaking, these were maneuvers through which the Muslims learned a great deal about their enemies, their capabilities, their strong influence on other tribes, and the depth of their feelings against the new state. At the same time, these maneuvers enhanced the Muslims' fighting ability and enriched their knowledge of the surrounding area. The first expedition set out barely 6 months after the Prophet's arrival in Medina. 30 men from the Muhajirin, commanded by Hamza, the Prophet's uncle, went towards the coast to stop a Quraysh trading caravan. The leader of the caravan was none other than Abu Jahl, who had 300 men with him. No clash took place, as a tribal chief called Majdi ibn Amr of Juhayna intervened to prevent it. This expedition took place in Ramadan of the first year of the Islamic calendar. The following month, Shawwal, the Prophet's companion, Ubadah ibn al-Harith, commanded a 60-man strong expedition with the Prophet's instructions to go deep into the district of Rabigh, which was closer to Mecca than Medina. There, at a spring called Ahya, they met Abu Sufyan leading a Quraysh force of 200 men. The two sides shot their arrows at each other, but no direct fighting took place. A few weeks later in Dhul Qa'dah, Sa'd ibn Abu Waqqas was the commander of a 20-man strong expedition which went on foot, traveling by night and hiding during the day. On the 5th day, they arrived at a place called Al-Kharar, which was, according to their instructions, the furthest point they could reach. Having learned that the Quraysh caravan they were supposed to intercept had been a whole day ahead of them, they had to go back. Nearly 3 months later, in Safar of the following year, the Prophet himself led a group of his companions and set out until he reached a place called Wadan. There he concluded a peace agreement with a tribe called Damra. He met no enemy and went back. Having rested in Medina for a short while, he set out again, leaving Abu Salama to deputize for him in Medina. He went as far as Al-Ashira, close to Yanbu, where he stayed for a few days and made another peace agreement with the allied tribes of Mudlij and Damra. He then went back to Medina. Shortly afterwards, Qarz ibn Jabir of the Fihr tribe raided the grazing grounds on the outskirts of Medina. The Prophet himself chased him with a group of his companions up to the valley of Safwan, close to Badr. Qarz escaped. Historians call this chase the first Badr expedition. As time passed, expeditions increased in frequency and significance. A particular one deserves to be mentioned here because of its eventual outcome. A very small group of people went on this expedition, having had clear instructions. As the company was ready to depart, the Prophet gave Abdullah ibn Jash, its commander, his written instructions. He told him not to read them until he had been on his way for 2 days. There he would learn more about his mission. He was specifically told not to force any of his men to go along with him. Should any of them want to go back, he was free to do so. When the company had been traveling for 2 days, Abdullah opened his sheet of instructions and read, "When you have read this, proceed until you reach the valley of Nakhla, midway between Makkah and Taif. Try to get whatever information you can about the Quraysh." Abdullah said, "I shall, most willingly." He then turned to his companions and said, "God's messenger has commanded me to go as far as Nakhla on a spying mission, to learn some news of the Quraysh. He has bid me not to force any of you to come along with me. Those of you who aspire to martyrdom are welcome. Those who have other ideas may go back. As for myself, I am going to do as I have been bid by the Prophet." All his companions went along with him. None went back. Every pair of the group had one camel, which they rode in turn. At one point, one camel went astray. Its 2 riders, Sa'd ibn Abu Waqqas and Utbah ibn Ghazwan, went chasing him, while the rest of the company proceeded with their mission until they reached the Nakhla Valley, their appointed place. Presently, a small Quraysh caravan encamped close by them. When the Qurayshis noticed the presence of the company, they panicked Ukasha ibn Muhsin of the Muslim group made himself visible to the Qurayshis. He had shaved his head, which was a ritual most pilgrims and visitors to the Kaaba perform. The Qurayshis were thus led to believe that the other group, whom they did not recognize as Muslims, were ordinary pilgrims. A feeling of reassurance replaced their fear. Meanwhile, the Muslim company were debating among themselves what to do about the caravan. There was a complication. The date was the last day of Rajab, one of the 4 lunar months in which fighting was strictly forbidden. This applied to both the Quraysh and the Muslims. The problem for the Muslim company was that if they waited a day, the caravan would have reached the sanctuary of Mecca, where it could not be intercepted. If they attacked, they would violate the injunction of the 4 sacred months. Eventually, however, they decided to attack. Amr ibn al-Hadrami was killed by an arrow shot at him by Waqid ibn Abdullah. 2 more non-believers, Uthman ibn Abdullah and al-Hakam ibn Kaysan, surrendered to the Muslims. The 4th person from the Quraysh, Nawfal ibn Abdullah, managed to escape. The Muslim company was thus able to confiscate the caravan and head back to Medina. When they arrived, the Prophet refused to take the 2 prisoners or the caravan, saying to the company, "I have not asked you to fight in the sacred month." The company felt very distressed. Their Muslim brethren reproached them for their action. They did not know what to do and felt truly lost. This incident led to a fresh propaganda campaign by the Quraysh, who tried to smear the Prophet and his companions in the eyes of the other Arabs. They harped on the theme of their violation of the sacred month. The whole thing was a matter of affliction for the Muslims until God allayed their worries with fresh revelations of the Quran, which declared that to turn the Muslims out of Mecca was a much graver sin than the killing of a non-believer in the sacred month. They ask you about fighting in the sacred month. Say, fighting in it is a grave offense, but to turn people away from the path of God, to disbelieve in Him and the sacred mosque and to expel its people from it, all this is a much graver offense in God's view. Indeed, religious persecution is worse than killing. They, that is your enemies, will not cease to fight against you until they force you to renounce your faith, if they can. But he who renounces his faith and dies a non-believer, his works shall come to nothing in this world and in the world to come. It is such people who are destined for the fire, therein to abide forever. 2:17. When the Prophet received that revelation, he took custody of the 2 prisoners and divided the caravan among his companions. The Quraysh sent for the release of the 2 prisoners in return for ransom. The Prophet told them nothing could be done before the return of the other 2 of his companions, Sa'd and Utbah, who were delayed chasing their camel. "If you kill them," he said, "we will kill your 2 men." Sa'd and Utbah arrived shortly afterwards. The Prophet accepted the ransom for the 2 prisoners. One of them, al-Hakam ibn Kaysan, however, declared his acceptance of Islam and stayed in Medina. The other went back to Mecca, where he later died. The smear campaign launched by the Quraysh against the Prophet and his companions, making use of the fighting that took place in one of the 4 sacred months, soon died down after the Quran had put the whole issue in the right perspective. The Quraysh was guilty of much graver violations of divine laws and therefore had no right to claim any virtue for themselves or to shame the Muslims for their action, serious though it might have been. It is noteworthy here that despite the fact that the Quraysh and the rest of the Arabs did not believe in Islam and did not accept Muhammad, peace be upon him, as a prophet, they could not refute the argument of the Quran, whose words enjoyed much weight with the majority of Arabs. The expedition related above, led by Abdullah ibn Jahsh, was in a sense the turning point which transformed the early military maneuvers into well-organized military activity, including a number of major battles. That expedition was, perhaps, an early short peak which was a prelude to a climb of very high mountains. It was an expedition of 8 men penetrating deep into enemy territory to demonstrate the vulnerability of the southern trade route from Mecca to Yemen. The clash took place over 500 kilometers away from Medina in a valley midway between 2 centers of population which were very hostile to the Muslims, Mecca and Taif. It was therefore a demonstration of the Muslims' dedication to their cause and their willingness to take great risks to secure a strong, well-protected base for their faith. The early expeditions achieved considerable results for the Muslims. They enabled them to form a good idea of the geography and topography of the area surrounding Medina. They identified the routes followed by trade caravans traveling between Mecca and Syria. They also established contacts with several tribes in the area and entered into alliances with some of them. The Muslims also proved that they were powerful enough to defend themselves and their faith against any external or internal threat. They were aware that threats could potentially come from either direction. Internally, the Jews and the Arabs who had not accepted Islam could pose a threat, while externally, the Quraysh and her allies were on the lookout for a chance to crush the new Muslim state. The Prophet also introduced certain new tactics which he employed in these expeditions. Most important among these was secrecy, which helped in taking the enemy by surprise. As a result of these expeditions, the Quraysh recognized that its trade route to Syria was no longer secure. As Mecca relied on trade, such insecurity and the threat of an economic siege were restraining factors against the Quraysh making any rash move against the Muslims in Medina. The Prophet also established the necessary government machinery in Medina which could function smoothly in his absence. He utilized these expeditions to put the economic and trade relations between Medina and the surrounding areas on a sound basis. Medina was a city in the center of a largely Bedouin area. Bedouin raids on population centers are commonplace in all areas and ages. To avoid them, a city must take the necessary steps in two directions. Peaceful, through alliances made with at least a significant section of the Bedouin tribes. Militant, by demonstrating the ability to inflict painful, measured punishment when the need arises. The Prophet utilized his expeditions for this ultimate goal, in both these two directions, with remarkable success. Yet the struggle against paganism could not be won merely by sending out small expeditions to demonstrate Islamic force. A long, hard struggle was yet to come. An important event which took place some 16 or 17 months after the Prophet had settled in Medina was the change of direction Muslims face when they offer their prayers. While the Prophet was still in Mecca, he was ordered to turn towards Jerusalem when he prayed. Muslims complied with this divine instruction and continued to do so after they had emigrated to Medina, where they came in close contact with the Jews. The Jews used the fact that Muslims adopted their own holy city as their Qibla to claim that Judaism was the religion of truth and that Muhammad, peace be upon him, and his companions should adopt Judaism instead of calling on the Jews to accept Islam. Now, nearly 18 months after the establishment of the Islamic State in Medina, new Quranic revelations instructed the Prophet and the Muslims to turn towards the Kaaba in Mecca when they prayed. The Prophet himself was very pleased with this change, which he keenly desired but dared not request. The Jews in Medina countered with a sustained campaign of criticism as they felt that the change deprived them of their argument for refusing to accept Islam. Their new campaign sought to create doubts in the minds of Muslims as to the basis of their own religion. If it was right, the Jews argued, that the Muslims should formerly face Jerusalem in their prayers, then the new direction is wrong. They also told the Muslims, your prayers from now on would then be of no value. If, on the other hand, the new direction is right and the Kaaba is the true Qibla, then your prayers in the past were in vain. The Jews also argued that God, the Lord who knows all, does not change his instructions in that manner. The change clearly showed, the Jews went on, that Muhammad, peace be upon him, did not really receive any revelation from God. Reading the verses which speak of this subject and the argument that ensued in Medina shows that the Jewish campaign was not without results. Reassurance was needed and was indeed provided in a long passage in the Quran, which runs from verse 106 to verse 150 in the surah entitled The Cow. A word of explanation here may be useful. Arabs revered the Kaaba before the advent of Islam. To them, it was the symbol of their national glory. It was also one of the factors which held the Arab tribes together. Islam, however, requires of its followers total, undivided loyalty. Muslims must dedicate themselves wholly to God and the cause of Islam. The Prophet's companions must therefore abandon all their former loyalties, tribal, racial, or national. Hence, the need to separate their worship from their traditional reverence of the Kaaba. To accomplish this, they were ordered to turn towards Jerusalem when they prayed. After a period of time when the Muslims had accepted the new situation, moving away in the process from the rest of the Arabs, they were taught to regard the Kaaba in a different light. They were told to face it in their prayers because it was built by the two prophets, Abraham and Ishmael, peace be upon them, as a place wholly devoted to the worship of God alone. Thus it becomes part of the heritage of the Islamic nation, which has come into existence by way of answering Abraham's prayers, peace be upon him, to raise among his seed a prophet who would teach them the true religion. Thus, having achieved the objective of making the Muslims turn to Jerusalem in their prayers for a while, it was now time to give them their own distinctive Qibla, the Kaaba, the first house of worship ever built. This process made the Muslims keenly aware that they were the true heirs of Abraham, peace be upon him, and his religion, based on total submission to God. To be distinct from others is very important when one speaks of faith and worship, for worship is the visible expression of the beliefs which take root in the soul. If worship is visibly distinct from that of other religions, then it strengthens the perception that the religion itself is unique. The purpose of giving the Muslims their own Qibla must be seen in this light.